I said no, and he threw the coffee mug in my face. My name is Hannah Cooper. I'm 33 years old. I live in a quiet, carefully decorated house in Connecticut. It has white walls, gray furniture, and a kitchen island I used to love. That morning, the island was between me and Mark. The sun was still low. Light spilled gently across the countertop, catching on the steam rising from the 2 cups he'd just poured. We were having eggs, toast. It could have been any morning, but it wasn't. He asked, no told me to let Samantha use my card again. I paused, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I already did. And I was tired of bracing for his reaction. No, I said, calm, soft, but firm. I won't do that again. Mark froze mid-chew. His hand wrapped around his ceramic mug, the one I bought him on a Vermont trip years ago, tightened. Excuse me? His voice dropped into that cold, low place, the one I'd learned to tiptoe around. I said no, Mark, I repeated. It's been too many times, and it's always me left explaining the charges. The silence stretched long between us. Then came the eruption, short, sharp, terrifying in its precision. He stood fast. The mug snapped forward before I had time to flinch. Hot liquid. White shards. A sharp sting across my cheek. The crack of ceramic against tile. For a second, everything was still. Even the birds outside paused. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, dripping breath, shallow heartbeat, a thunderous drum in my ears. My fingers found the back of a chair. I wasn't holding on to balance. I was holding on to reality. He didn't apologize. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and stormed upstairs, leaving the wreckage at my feet. The coffee seeped across the tile like a slow-moving bruise. My face burned, but that wasn't the worst of it. What stung more was the familiar numbness that came flooding and the dull realization that this wasn't surprising. This was simply an escalation. This wasn't the first time he'd crossed a line. It was just the first time it left a mark. I moved slowly to the sink, letting the cold water run over my wrist, then pressed it gently to my face. No blood, just red. Swollen. Like shame, like rage, like something boiling just beneath the surface. Then I looked up and met my own eyes in the kitchen window's reflection. And that's when it hit me I didn't recognize her. The girl who once dreamed of opening a bookstore of writing essays that mattered, of cooking barefoot on Sunday mornings. She was gone. Replaced by this version who second-guessed her every thought, who accounted for another adult's every mood, who'd grown skilled at silence. And now this woman stood in a room where she had just been hit by the man who claimed to love her, and her first instinct was not fear. It was quite clear. I walked to the broom closet still in my robe and fetched the dustpan. I crouched carefully, gathering the shards of the mug we bought on a trip meant to fix things, the one with the pine trees on it. The one he liked was thick and heavy. I dumped the pieces into the trash bin. The sound it made ceramic on plastic felt final. Then I turned off the stove. The eggs had burned. The moment was still raw but not chaotic. Not yet. I could already feel something changing inside me, like a tectonic shift that begins with no sound at all. I didn't plan my escape at that moment. I didn't Google shelters or pack a suitcase. I just stood there, my hands wet, my face flushed, and my heart still. I have to go, I whispered aloud. Not because I was scared, because I was done. Not angry, not emotional, not vindictive. Just done. The kind of done that doesn't need to slam a door because you already know it's over. The kind of done that makes silence louder than screaming. Upstairs, I heard the floorboards creak. He'd come down soon. He'd probably pretend it didn't happen. Or worse, blame me for provoking him. He'd expect me to clean up, to apologize, to move on. But I already had. Somewhere deep inside me, the Hannah I used to be stirred awake. She didn't rise with a roar. She blinked. She took a breath. And she waited for me to catch up. The bathroom light flickered once before holding steady, casting a pale glow across the porcelain sink. I turned the faucet on and let the water run cold, then leaned in slowly. The mirror didn't flinch, but I did. there it was. A faint red streak spread across my cheekbone just beneath my eye. The skin was blotchy, tender, and angry-looking. But it wasn't the heat of the impact that lingered. It was the memory of how calm he had been right before, as if hurting me was just inevitable. I reached for a clean towel and pressed it against my face. My hand was shaking, not from pain, but from the weight of the years that led to this. Because truthfully, that coffee mug wasn't the first thing he ever threw at me. The first thing was a question asked months after our wedding. "Are you wearing that?" I had smiled, confused, and said, "What's wrong with it?" He kissed my forehead. "Nothing, baby. I just think you'd look even better in the navy one." That was how it started. Not with a slap, with a suggestion, not with a bruise, with a better option spoken sweetly. The Mark I married was charming, generous with compliments. He brought me flowers every Sunday. But slowly the warmth grew conditional. The praise came with strings. The flowers stopped altogether. At first I thought I was changing, maybe growing distant, more forgetful, more emotional. I began second-guessing myself, apologizing for things I didn't understand, explaining my every move before he even asked. One by one, he erased my anchors. He stopped liking my best friend Jenna, said she was toxic, dramatic, jealous of us. I started seeing her less, then almost not at all. He called my writing cute but discouraged me from applying for the workshop in Portland. Said we couldn't afford the time off. When I offered to go back to part-time work, he shook his head. "Why would you do that? You don't need to. Just manage things here. That's more than enough." So I stayed home. I started shrinking slowly, invisibly, until I barely cast a shadow anymore. And now, standing in the mirror, I saw what I had become, a woman still young but worn thin, with strong bones but no voice. A woman who had been loved once but not cherished, who had been taught to interpret neglect as normal. The tear didn't fall until I saw it, a line in the fogged mirror. My name written with a fingertip from who knows when. Hannah. It felt like a signature from a past life, a version of me who still believed in her worth. I let the towel drop into the sink, walked to the bedroom, and reached for my phone. My thumb hovered over her name, Jenna Michaels. There had been times I wanted to call her before, hundreds probably, but I always told myself it was too late, that maybe she didn't care anymore, that I had picked Mark, and by extension, I had unpicked her. But tonight felt different, because for once I wasn't scared of what she'd say. I was scared of what would happen if I stayed. The phone rang once, twice, then Hannah. Her voice cracked like the first beam of light after a long storm. My throat tightened. "I need to go. I think I'm done." There was no hesitation. "Pack what matters," she said. "I'm on my way. No lectures, no blame, just presence." 27 minutes later, her car pulled into the driveway. She didn't even park properly, just stopped in front of the house, headlights off, hazard lights blinking like a quiet siren. I met her outside with a duffel bag, a laptop, my wallet, and a small box that held things Mark never bothered to ask about: my father's old wristwatch, a postcard from a road trip Jenna and I took when we were 19, and a copy of The Awakening that I never stopped carrying, even when I stopped believing in it. She looked at my face, the mark already fading, but didn't say a word. Instead, she pulled me into a hug, so full of memory that it nearly knocked me over. "I've got you," she whispered. And that was the first moment I realized I didn't need to explain everything. I just needed to leave, and someone to believe me when I said it's over. As we drove into the night, I glanced in the side mirror. The house grew smaller. The porch light is still on, the door still closed, but inside, I'd left behind the version of me who waited for permission to be free. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe maybe she was coming back. The woman I used to be. The woman who looked back in the mirror and didn't flinch. Jenna's guest room was small, tucked under the sloped ceiling of her townhouse. But that night it felt like a sanctuary. The lamp by the bed cast a soft amber light. There was a fuzzy blanket folded at the foot, and a lavender candle she probably forgot she'd lit. It smelled like calm, like safety. I sat on the edge of the bed holding a mug of tea I hadn't touched. My hands were still wrapped around it more for the comfort of weight than warmth. Jenna sat across from me cross-legged in her oversized sweatshirt, the same way she used to during college sleepovers. But we weren't kids anymore. And I wasn't here because we wanted to stay up late watching old movies. I was here because I had nowhere else left that felt like mine. She didn't ask questions right away. She just waited, gave me space to find the words. And eventually they came slow at first, like thick molasses pulled from the back of my throat. "I didn't even notice it happening," I said. "He was so gentle in the beginning, always checking on me, asking if I was okay, telling me he just wanted to protect me." Jenna nodded slowly, eyes soft but sharp. She knew where this was going. She'd seen it before, long before I did. "He said my friends didn't understand me, that they didn't support our marriage. He said you were jealous." I paused, ashamed, and I believed him. I stopped calling. I stopped showing up. She didn't flinch. No bitterness, just a sad kind of knowing. "I figured," she said quietly. "But I also knew you'd come back when you were ready." The words made my throat tighten. I took a breath and kept going. "He took over our finances. Said it was easier if he handled things. One less stress for me. But then my debit card stopped working, and when I asked, he said I'd been overspending." A dry laugh escaped me. On what groceries? I looked down at the tea, now cold. Then came the little rules. When I go out, what should I wear? Whether I should post a picture. He never yelled, not at first. He just made me feel guilty. Like I owed him explanations. For everything. I met Jenna's eyes. I stopped trusting myself. She leaned forward, took the mug from my hands, and set it on the nightstand. Then she took my hands in hers and said something I didn't expect. "That's what emotional abuse does, Han. It rearranges your reality. Slowly, quietly, until you're living in someone else's version of your life and calling it love." That was the moment I started crying, not because of what Mark had done, but because I finally had words for it. Jenna let me cry. No interruptions, no advice, just her steady presence beside me, proof that not everyone leaves. The next morning she made me coffee and set a small folder beside my plate. Inside, the name of a lawyer. "I trust him," she said. "He helped Rachel when she left her ex." The name on the card read, Thomas Whitman-esque. Underneath, in smaller print, family law, domestic protection, recovery advocacy. At first I hesitated. Something about seeing my life reduced to a case felt clinical. But Jenna said, "You don't need to be ready to fight. Just be ready to understand your options." And that felt like enough. 2 days later, we sat in a quiet, sunlit office filled with warm woods and thick books. Mr. Whitman was in his 50s, kind-eyed, no nonsense. The kind of man who had seen too much but never stopped caring. He listened without interrupting, took notes, nodded when I described the mug, the red mark, the way Mark always apologized without really apologizing. Then he leaned back in his chair, folded his hands and said, "You're not alone, you're not crazy, and you're not powerless." I blinked. I don't want this to get ugly." He smiled gently. "It's already been ugly, Ms. Cooper. What we're going to do now is make it legal, safe, fair." He explained the plan: file for divorce with documentation, seek a protection order, close joint accounts, establish a new financial identity, start collecting evidence. It wasn't about revenge, it was about recovery. "It's not about burning the house down," he said. "It's about walking out the front door with everything that still belongs to you and refusing to be locked in again." Then he added quietly, but firmly, "We won't just leave. We'll reclaim what's yours." And in that moment, something inside me shifted. For the first time, I saw this not as an escape, but as a return. A way back to my name, my own life, my voice. We shook hands. And that evening, for the first time in years, I slept with the door unlocked, not because I forgot to lock it, but because I wasn't afraid anymore. We waited until Mark left for work. Thursday mornings were always his earliest meetings errands, sometimes coffee with a colleague he never named. The garage door closed at 7:42 a.m. sharp. By 7:45, Jenna's car was parked 2 blocks down. We approached the house like women on a mission, not a heist. There was no panic in our steps, just a deliberate, practiced calm. The key still worked. The door creaked open into a silence I hadn't heard in years. A silence that didn't hold tension, but memory. The walls didn't seem threatening now, just hollow. Just walls. Jenna followed close behind. She didn't ask questions. She didn't rush. She simply moved like someone who had done this before for someone else. Someone who knew the cost of moving too fast or too slow. I went room by room methodically. First the study. My laptop sat on the desk exactly where I'd left it. The screensaver flickered to life as I closed it and slid it into a padded sleeve. Then the file drawer. Birth certificate, passport, tax returns, old journals I didn't even know I still had. I took what was mine and nothing more. In the hallway closet, I pulled down a shoebox that once held sneakers I wore on our honeymoon. Inside, wrapped in a threadbare scarf, was the savings passbook I'd opened secretly the year before. I never told Mark. It had only a few $1,000s. But it was mine, my emergency exit fund. I held it for a second, fingers tightening around it. Not because I doubted what I was doing, but because I realized how long I had known this day might come. Sometimes strength doesn't come roaring in a moment of clarity. Sometimes it starts a year earlier when you quietly open a new account with $100, when you tuck away evidence, when you teach yourself to wait. In the bedroom, I took only what mattered. A photo of my parents from their wedding day, the silver locket my grandmother left me, a worn paperback of The Awakening folded at the spine. No clothes, no shoes, no wedding ring. That had been left in a dish by the sink the morning after he threw the mug. Jenna waited in the hallway, that everything she asked gently. I nodded. But before we left, I walked through the house one last time. No ceremony, just movement. The living room where I once decorated every Christmas. The kitchen where we celebrated our first anniversary with cheap wine and frozen pizza because we were broke and in love. The hallway mirror that I stopped looking into because I didn't recognize myself anymore. None of it made me cry. There was no grief left to give. Just emptiness. The kind that comes after a storm when everything is still standing, but you know you'll never live there again. Before I stepped out the door, I turned back and looked at the home we built, and realized it had never been a home for me. It was a performance set, a place where I played the role of good wife while losing scene after scene of myself. But now, the curtain had closed. I didn't slam the door. I didn't lock it behind me. I simply walked out one foot after the other with the past at my back and my name on every item I carried. In the car, Jenna started the engine. She glanced over. "You okay?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the small box on my lap. Documents, memories, proof that I had once belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't here. "I'm not sad," I said softly. "That's the strange part." Jenna nodded. "That's not strange, Han. That's clarity." We drove off slowly. No sirens, no screams, just the quiet hum of freedom humming low and steady beneath us. And as we turned the corner, I realized something the strongest part of me wasn't the woman who ran. It was the woman who prepared, the woman who smiled at dinner tables where she didn't feel safe, the woman who stashed $20 every time he forgot to ask, the woman who memorized her exit long before she took it. Because not all battles are fought loudly. Some are won by staying quiet long enough to hear your voice again. And that morning, for the first time in a long, long time, I heard mine. It started with a pen, a black ink signature across the top corner of a beige form, petition for divorce. Thomas Whitman slid the final copy across the table toward me. "This is your line, Hannah, right here." I signed slowly, my hand steady. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I finally knew this wasn't an ending. It was a reclamation. He clipped the papers together. We'll file today. And we'll file strong. The packet included photos, the bruise on my cheekbone, the shattered mug in the kitchen, the time-stamped text messages that started calm and turned to threats when I didn't respond. I'll request an emergency protective order immediately. Whitman continued, but we'll also start gathering every financial record tied to your name. You don't just leave a man like Mark. You legally separate your life from his piece by piece. That afternoon, I followed his advice like a checklist, small methodical acts that felt like laying bricks beneath my own feet. First, I called the bank. I canceled our joint credit card, transferred my name off our shared checking account, and froze my credit. It felt like taking back breaths I didn't know I'd given away. Then I opened a new account. Just mine. The banker asked what I wanted to name it. Without thinking, I said Cooper Holdings, my last name, my identity, no hyphens, no compromises. That night I turned off my phone and left it charging in the other room. A strange sense of safety crept in, knowing Mark no longer had access not to my inbox, my money, or my choices, but he noticed. The next morning, Jenna showed me the text, "Tell your friend to answer her damn phone. She's not done with me. It wasn't even about me anymore. It was about control." We took the message straight to Mr. Whitman. That afternoon, he stood in front of a judge with everything we'd prepared. Clear, clean, undeniable. By sunset, the emergency protective order was granted. Mark was legally barred from contacting me, showing up at Jenna's house, or making any demands through third parties. That piece of paper didn't change the past, but it gave me something I hadn't had in years. Space. Space to breathe, to think, to start again. And so I did something small, something ordinary. I went to a bookstore. Not just any bookstore, the Paper Lantern, a little shop I used to walk past on my way to campus, back when I was still in school, and believed I'd be a writer one day. I hadn't applied for a job in nearly 5 years. My resume was thin, my confidence thinner. But something inside me whispered, "Try anyway." The woman behind the counter was in her 60s, with silver streaks in her braids and a pair of glasses on a chain around her neck. Her name was Megan. "I'm not sure if you're hiring," I began, nerves prickling along my spine, "but I'd love to help out here. I used to write. I love books. I'm trying to start over." She looked me over, not in judgment, but in understanding, like she'd seen women walk in before with the same quiet hunger behind their smiles. "Have you ever worked with inventory?" she asked. I nodded. "And I alphabetize compulsively." She laughed. "You'll fit right in." We talked for 20 minutes about poetry, paperbacks, what it feels like to hold something in your hands that once lived in someone else's head. Before I left, she handed me a schedule. Part-time for now, weekdays only. But it was a beginning. As I walked out of the Paper Lantern, I passed a shelf near the door. One book caught my eye, Women Who Run with the Wolves. I smiled. Not because I felt fierce, but because I finally felt seen. Later that night, I lay in Jenna's guest room, the soft glow of a string light running along the headboard, and I wrote the first journal entry in years. Every step I take is a brick in the road back to myself. Even if they're small, they matter. Even if they hurt. Especially if they hurt. The next morning, I took my first cup of coffee in my mug. Not his. Not ours. Mine. It wasn't the best tasting coffee, but it was the first one that felt like freedom. The bell above the door chimed softly each time I opened it, a sound that slowly became the metronome of my mornings. The Paper Lantern was unlike any place I had ever worked. The shelves leaned slightly from years of being loved. Dust floated like soft confetti in the beams of sunlight that cut through the front windows. There were always 3 things playing in the background: classical music, the smell of old pages, and Megan's steady hum as she watered the plants near the poetry section. There was no clock in, clock out, no dress code, just a clipboard that said, "Welcome back if you're here, you're right on time." In my second week, Megan handed me a box of new arrivals to shelf. She didn't give instructions, just winked and said, "Alphabetize like your soul depends on it." I sat cross-legged between 2 bookcases, tracing the titles with my fingers when I saw it. A faded dog-eared copy of The Awakening by Kate Chopin. It felt like being struck softly but with meaning. I held the book like it was sacred. I hadn't seen it in years, but I remembered everything about it the way it made me feel the first time I read it in college. Like someone had cracked open a window inside me and said, "Breathe, girl. There's more." Back then, I used to dream of writing something like that. A story that didn't rescue a woman, but simply permitted her to feel her heart beat again. Now here it was in my hands, and I was no longer the girl who underlined sentences and folded corners with hope. I was someone new, someone quieter, wiser, bruised, but intact. I opened the front page and read the first line, then the second. Then I couldn't see the third because my eyes were full of tears. I didn't sob. I didn't make a sound. But in that moment between two wooden shelves, I finally cried not from pain, but from recognition. Megan found me 10 minutes later, still holding the book, my back resting against the wall. "You okay, sweetheart?" she asked gently. I nodded, wiping my cheek. "Just remembering who I used to be." She smiled. "Maybe this is your awakening too." It wasn't a declaration. It was a knowing, a whisper, not a scream. That night I took the book home with me. Megan said it belongs to whoever needs it most. In Jenna's guest room now, more mine than borrowed, I lit the lavender candle and pulled out my journal. My handwriting had changed. It was steadier now, less tentative. And on a fresh page I wrote, "I thought I was a shadow. Now I'm the light I used to wait for." There was no applause, no witness, just me and the silence that no longer felt threatening. In the days that followed, small things became my anchors. I learned the names of regular customers. I restocked the children's corner with sticker books and kept an eye on the teenager who always tried to sneak romance novels into his backpack. I never called him out, just quietly left a few near the register for him to accidentally discover. I brought my mug to work. Jenna had bought it for me. It said, "Soft doesn't mean weak." And sometimes when the shop was quiet, I would stand near the window and watch people pass by. Mothers, students, men in suits, women in silence. I wondered how many of them were also rebuilding something no one else could see. Because healing doesn't look like fireworks. It looks like brushing your teeth every morning even when no one's watching. It looks like saying no without explanation. It looks like choosing the slower lane just because it feels safer. It looks like walking into a bookstore and not apologizing for wanting to stay. One evening after closing, Megan sat across from me with 2 cups of tea. "You've changed since you started," she said. I smiled. "I think I'm remembering who I am." "No," she said, tapping her mug. "You're not remembering, you're rewriting." And in that stillness, I realized something beautiful. Freedom hadn't arrived like a thunderstorm. It had seeped in through the cracks through every ordinary act of self-respect I'd stitched into my days. I didn't need to be saved, I just needed to see myself again. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the knock came. 3 slow, forceful hits against Jenna's front door, the kind of knock that wasn't asking, but announcing. Jenna looked at me from across the room. I didn't panic. I didn't even stand. I just said quietly, "It's him." When the door opened, there they were, Mark and Samantha. He looked the same. That was the strange part. I had imagined he might shrink or shiver, that time might have softened his presence. It hadn't. He still wore the jacket I bought him 2 Christmases ago. His hair was styled, his jaw was tight. The only difference was the tension in his eyes, no longer confident, but hungry. Desperate. Samantha stood behind him, arms folded, chewing gum, like she was daring someone to push her. "Can we talk?" Mark asked. "Alone." Jenna stepped forward. "This is my house. I'm not here to fight," he said, ignoring her. His eyes locked on me. "I just think we deserve a conversation." I stood, calm, measured, and then a voice behind me said, "That's not how this works anymore." Thomas Whitman had entered through the side door, quiet professional holding a folder like it was a weapon. He moved between us like a wall. "I represent Ms. Cooper," he said, voice even. "All communication goes through me, from this moment forward." Mark scoffed. "Are you serious?" "I am." Samantha rolled her eyes. "We're not here about the marriage, we're here about the money." Specifically, she said louder, "what she owes me." Mr. Whitman didn't even blink. "Any assets in question have been documented and submitted. Your name isn't on any of them, which means your inquiry is legally speaking irrelevant." Samantha's face turned red. "You're kidding." "I don't kid," he said, then looked at Mark. "Do not contact her again." Mark laughed sharp and bitter. "This is insane. We built everything together. She doesn't just get to walk away." That's when I finally spoke. Not loud, not shaken, just, "Ready." "You lost me," I said slowly, the moment that mug hit the floor. He froze. The silence in the room grew thick. I kept going. "But the truth is you lost me long before that, when you make every decision you feel like permission, when you replaced listening with manipulation, when you stopped loving me and started owning me." His mouth opened, then closed. Samantha looked away. I took one step forward, not toward him, but into myself. "You don't get to rewrite what happened. You don't get to drag me back because you're uncomfortable being alone in a house you didn't build." "I made you," he hissed under his breath. "No," I replied. "You broke me. But I rebuilt. And now you don't recognize the version of me that doesn't need your voice to hear my own." He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He just stood there in the doorway, with everything he'd used to control me slipping through his fingers. The power, the fear, the access, gone. Mark looked at Mr. Whitman, then at Jenna, and finally at me. "You'll regret this," he said. I nodded once. "Maybe. But it won't be today." He turned. Samantha followed, though, not without muttering something under her breath about ungrateful women. But I didn't catch it. I didn't need to. They left. The door closed with a soft click. No slam. No dramatic exit. Just finality. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Jenna walked over and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't even raise your voice." I shook my head. I didn't need to. Because when the truth is on your side, you don't need volume. You need presence. Mr. Whitman packed his folder with quiet satisfaction that he said was better than court. And for the first time I believed it. Because I hadn't just faced a man. I had faced a version of myself I had once allowed to be silenced. And I didn't flinch. The apartment wasn't big. 600 square feet, a second-floor walk-up. The kitchen sink groaned when I ran hot water, and the window in the bedroom didn't quite shut unless you jiggled the frame. But it was mine. No one asked why I picked mustard yellow curtains. No one rolled their eyes at my floral throw pillows. I could leave dishes in the sink or wash them immediately, and either way, no one would say a word. I bought a table from a thrift shop, sanded it down myself. The wood beneath the peeling paint was soft and warm, like it had waited years for someone to see its worth. That table became my everything dinner spot, reading nook writing desk. Every morning I brewed coffee strong with cinnamon, just how I liked it, not how he liked it, not how we always did it, just mine. The first time I sat down at the table with my chipped mug and notebook, I froze, not because I didn't have words, because I had too many. I wrote slowly at first, simple things. A line about the way the afternoon light curved across my kitchen wall. A memory of my father reading poetry when I was little. A grocery list that somehow turned into a haiku. Then one night I wrote, "I didn't find a new woman. I returned to the girl I once was and chose her again." I stared at the sentence for a long time, because it was true. I hadn't reinvented myself. I had excavated her, the younger version of me, who used to sit cross-legged in bookstores and believe she could live a life filled with soft mornings and good words. The girl who didn't settle, who didn't bend her spine to be understood. She had waited, patiently, quietly, beneath the noise. And now she was home. The apartment grew into a sanctuary. I strung fairy lights around the bookshelves. I pressed flowers between the pages of old journals. I adopted a cat named her Louisa, after Louisa May Alcott. At night, I danced barefoot to Ella Fitzgerald while folding laundry. There was no one to impress, no one to please. Just a woman, rebuilding herself in the smallest, most beautiful ways. Sometimes I stood in front of the bathroom mirror the same way I did that morning when the mug shattered. But now, the reflection was different. Not because my face had changed, but because I looked directly into my own eyes and didn't flinch. I whispered to my reflection like a vow. You are enough. Not because you survived, but because you finally chose yourself. The scars were still there, some emotional, some etched into memory. But they didn't define me. They were the soil from which I had grown. On weekends, I wrote short stories, tales of quiet bravery of women leaving in the rain with nothing but car keys and dignity. I didn't share them yet. I didn't have to. Just writing them made me feel more alive than I had in years. Jenna came over once with cupcakes and wine. "This place is so you," she said, smiling. "It's the first place I've ever lived that wasn't someone else's dream," I replied. She raised her glass. "To beginnings," I corrected her gently. "To return. Because that's what healing had taught me. You don't always need to leap into something new. Sometimes you just need to walk back to the place where you lost your voice and pick it up again." The girl I used to be. She wasn't weak, she was unfinished, and now finally I was whole.